All right, our new press, Iconic Books, is publishing its seventh book, and this is my version of the Gilgamesh epic, which I wrote as a kind of poetic novel, written in kind of poetic prose, back in 2017 when I originally published it, and now we're republishing it in a way upgraded version with lots of full-color AI illustrations, which I'm having a lot of fun with, discovering AI, some amazing images, as those of you who saw my archive presentation already know. And so Gilgamesh, it's really one of the most famous stories in human history. Everyone on the planet has heard of Gilgamesh. He's the prototype for Hercules in Greek mythology and for Samson in Jewish mythology and so forth. The guy who is capable of doing great deeds of enormous strength eventually ends up echoing as Superman all the way across the Atlantic to America. And his quest for immortality and dealing with death. It was, back in the ancient days, the most famous. It was the Star Wars of its time. Everyone had a translation of it. There's a Hittite translation of it. There's a Canaanite translation of it. I don't think there's an Egyptian translation, not that I know of, but I would be very surprised if they hadn't heard of it. It was famous all over the Middle East, and it has sent echoes into Indian mythology and into Western Greek mythology as Hercules and his 12 labors. And do note that those 12 labors correspond to the 12 signs of the zodiac, even though there are different animals in there, different creatures and so forth. Nonetheless, that's a clue that the Gilgamesh epic was originally about a man in the role of the sun traveling along the ecliptic, which is to say the zodiac, because I found all kinds of Babylonian constellations in here. I submitted a paper to the Journal of Near Eastern Studies way back, maybe 2015 or so, with my thesis that the story is about a man being initiated into the mysteries by going through all 12 signs of the zodiac. It's obvious that everyone agrees that the gigantic bull that attacks the city is Taurus. It's obvious that it's Taurus. Well, what about the lion that he slays? That kind of sounds like Leo to me. And what about the scorpion people that he meets? That kind of sounds like Scorpio to me. And what about Utnapishtim, who is the Noah figure? Sounds a lot like Aquarius to me. It's not that hard to put together. But the guy told me, well, the thing is that the Babylonians did not have an astronomical record until the Mulapin tablets, and those date from 1000 BC. And the old Babylonian version of Gilgamesh, which is to say the first version of it as an epic, there are 5 Sumerian stories, but they're not connected, that predate it. Gilgamesh himself lived about 2600 BC, the man, the actual person. And then pretty soon a cult developed around him. As Thorkel Jacobson describes all of this in his excellent book, Treasures of Darkness. And then there grew up a death cult around him, and gradually he was transformed into a god. And this is why I've written variations of his name here. This is the Akkadian, or actually Old Babylonian, but they're writing in Akkadian, version of his name. And notice the star. The star is a determinative, and it is a star, because for them, when you mention the name of a god, you have to put a star in front of it, the dingir, as it's called, because for them, all their gods were stars. And so once Gilgamesh has that star in front of his name, now he's a god. And he does indeed become the lord of the underworld. He displaces both Ereshkigal and Nergal. In some cases, he becomes identified with Nergal. So it is very much an epic about death, and I think that the ending is presupposed. I don't think the story is not about a man who tried to quest for immortality but failed because we're all mortal and sad. He goes back to the city. That's not what the story is about. This is a man, the first man in history to be initiated through the 12 signs of the zodiac. Now he's ready to become the Lord of the Dead. He's ready. He's becoming transformed into a god. And there is indeed a text that is appended, and I've transformed it into an epilogue here. Originally, there were only 11 tablets, which sounds suspicious to me, a missing 12th. And the 12th that's added in actually is a completely different story regarding his sidekick, Enkidu. But there's another story where the gods are transforming him into the Lord of the Dead. And that's what everybody knew. It's like when you read the Iliad, we don't need to see Achilles' death. everyone knows how he dies. It's presupposed by the audience. So the scholars are wrong on this, and I'm correct. As so often is the case with academics telling me I'm wrong. No, I'm not. I'm right because I think outside the box. I'm not trapped in the academic box. In academia, they're not training you to become a creator of new ideas. They're training you to become a guardian of old, worn-out ideas whose time has come. So they don't understand innovation. They don't understand how culture works by new ideas coming in from the periphery and eventually winding up in the center, as mine eventually will. That's 100% certain. Okay, so Gilgamesh, and then it might have been an earlier form, Pa-Bilgamesh, but that's 4 syllables. And humans are lazy when it comes to language, so gradually over time we usually contract words. Cannot becomes can't, and so forth. So maybe they got rid of the Pa and Bilgamesh. Mesh refers to a certain type of sacred tree, the Meshu tree. We're not sure which actual tree it was, but it's a sacred tree. So he's connected to the sacred tree, and then Harta Foundation in Hamlet's Mill says that sacred tree, and they do end up chopping down the sacred cedar tree and causing a cosmic accident, refers to the pole star, and it's shifting. Cutting it down shifts the pole star, so it goes backward, and it's in precession. Every 72 years, it precesses backward 1 degree. So when March rolls around and we're in the equinox, everybody says, well, in the West especially, who clings to the tropical zodiac, we're in Aries right now. Actually, we're not. The sun has precessed. We're in the tail end of the tail fish of Pisces, and we're precessing backward during that spring equinox into the constellation of Aquarius, which is a constellation, by the way, that's associated with science and technology. So I think that's a good bet. And we're a couple of centuries away from it. It's a good bet. Science is going to be around for a long, long time, at least another 2,000 years. Okay, so Bilgamesh. Jishjinmesh is normally the way that it's orthographically transliterated. And Tuaram means to return. So this is Gilgamesh Redux, Gilgamesh Return. And now I've called it Gilgamesh Redux Squared because this is sort of my Gilgamesh Redux 2.0. It seemed kind of clumsy and oafish to put a 2.0 there. It's a little more elegant to use the algebraic notation. After all, algebra came from the Middle East, from the Arabs, the whole Arabic world. And then so I've got the indication of divinity there. And nothing's capitalized in this book because this is way back before they were capitalizing letters. So none of the letters here are capitalized except originally published as Gilgamesh Redux, a Poetic Cycle on April 14th, 2017 on Amazon KDP. All right, and special thanks go to my brother. My brother, Tom, and I are creating this press. This is the 7th book that we're publishing in hardcover, full color, super res images. And this is the 7th one, and it's just he and I doing this. And so we have set up a GoFundMe page to take donations, and I'll put the link down below. For anyone who is kind enough, thankful enough for these books to donate, because we really could use the money. And my friend Michael Aaron Kamens, who was one of the original people who read this, a great Los Angeles poet. If you haven't read him or heard of him, you need to. You need to read Absences, you need to read Clouds, and he's got a 3rd one on the way, Invisible Carnival, which I'm hoping that I'll be able to publish through Iconic Books. We also have the photography of Ray Grassi, the astrologer, who is an incredible digital photographer who's a collection of whose photographs that I want to publish as part of the press as well. So it's not just about me, publishing a lot of other stuff. And Josh Hicks, who's another writer that you haven't heard of yet, but you will. I've had a glimpse at this book that he's been working on, and he says he's got like another 5 years or so to work through it. It's damn good. And then, of course, Mary Church, always. She's my muse. She's my, what is called in Indian mythology, my Shakti. She inspires me to do great things. All right, then. So notice, instead of table of contents, we have tablets of contents, because they wrote on tablets. And then here are the poems. We have an invocation to the sun god Shamash, Babylonian Shamash, Sumerian Utu. I'm retaining the Babylonian names because this is really a Babylonian epic. The Babylonians are sort of like to the Sumerians what the Romans were to the Greeks, a late, decadent, degenerate version of their culture. But on the other hand, during the period of Hammurabi, who more or less corresponds to Augustus Caesar, I would say, and all the writers that were part of the Augustan age of literature, Virgil and Ovid and so forth. And here he had the author of this, whose name we do not know, although I talked to a medium and I asked her to try to fish his name out, and she said, it's not really clear to me, but it's 2 syllables, whatever it is, like Shawshank. And I thought, that's interesting. If it is Shawshank, that was a common name for pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom. So that's interesting, Shawshank. A note on Maskaygasher, who is historically the man who founded, circa 2800 BC, the first dynasty of Uruk. And all of this centers around solar heroes. This is the solar dynasty of Uruk that begins with Maskaygasher, then his son Enmerkar, who invents writing, and then his son Lugalbanda, who becomes the world's first superhero and is actually a personification of the planet of Mercury. Gilgamesh, who himself is a personification or a human stand-in, you might say, in that semiotic slot of the sun. Prologue with Akka. When he's a young man, he fights a battle, and that's not in the Gilgamesh epic. It's a separate Sumerian story. As I say, there were 5 Sumerian stories, but I seem to recall hearing that a 6th was found recently, but I couldn't find any evidence for it online. So if anyone knows about that 6th story and whether it's been made public or not, I know scholars like to hoard and hide things for as long as possible from the general public because they want to be sure who gets the credit for what. It's all about ego in academia. So then we have the 12 tablets, and then the epilogue is the 12th in my version of it, which is based on the text of Gilgamesh being transformed into the Lord of the Dead. So the invocation to Shamash, and I'll read this. In those days, in those far-off days when the earth was still soft and pliant, it was you, Shamash, who carved your way out from beneath Ershetu and split the Mashu mountains in half. And this is what he's doing over here. This is Shamash. He's got a saw here in his left hand. Every morning he has to saw the earth apart to rise up out of it. And notice that we have the same motif of the 2 mountains, which are called in the epic the Mashu Mountains, that we have in Egypt, with the 2 pylons from in between which the sun there too arises every day. So there are some cultural overlaps here that are very interesting that scholars want to pretend don't exist. The Mashu Mountains in half, they ruptured into 2 peaks, volcanic magma pouring forth from them in red-orange glowing burning liquid streams from the fissure out of which you emerged, a gigantic being, carrying a saw in one hand and wearing a headdress of bull's horns as you shoved your way up out of the mountain and stepped forth to rumble the ground, and walked a god, a giant, as you strode across the soft skin of the earth, your eyes unbearable to look at as you glowed, the sun god incarnate, and father of Maskaygasher, who was father of Enmerkar, who was father of Lugalbanda, who was in turn father of Gilgamesh. May you glow forever, great one. And here's a note on Maskaygasher. I'll read this as well, but I'm not going to read the story about Enmerkar. I'm going to skip that. Who invents writing? I'm going to skip that and go to Lugalbanda. Around the year 2800 BC, King Maskaygasher founded the first dynasty of Uruk as a rival dynasty to that of Kish. He was the contemporary of Etana, the king of Kish, who flew to the celestial domain of the goddess Inanna on the back of an eagle. The Sumerian king list states that Maskaygasher was the son of the sun god Utu, Babylonian Shamash, and that he founded the dynasty and ruled for 324 years. More mysteriously, it also says that he entered the sea and disappeared, and also ascended the mountain, which is possibly an epithet for death. Mythologically, it could mean that he disappeared into the sea, like the setting sun. Or, on the literal level, it may refer to an expedition down the Persian Gulf to Oman, ancient Magan, in order to acquire the much-needed copper to create weapons for his dynasty. An ascent to the mountain may refer to a journey to the Zagros Mountains, that's in the north, far north, to obtain tin necessary for the production of bronze weapons. The city of Uruk, Sumerian Unug, with its 2 temple complexes, the White Temple of Kulab And that's what we see here in this digital rendering. This is one of the very first ziggurats that comes into being right around 3000 BC or so. And with its the temple of Kulab, sacred to the high god On. On is most likely a personification of the pole star, because he's the father of Inanna. And notice that Inanna is Venus, essentially, and Venus rules over Taurus, hence their connection later on in the story when she begs her father to punish Gilgamesh by sending the gigantic Taurus bull, like a Godzilla creature, to ravage the city of Uruk. And he and Enkidu make short work of it. And it of course, offends her, but that's intentional on their part. They make fun of her as they're hacking it to pieces. And the Eanna complex, sacred to Inanna, probably amounted to little more than a kind of Carolingian fortified castle, receiving influences from the more cosmopolitan cities of Kish and Nippur to the north. In any event, he is the father of Enmerkar, the second king of the dynasty. And so this then tells the tale of Enmerkar. I'm not going to go through it, but remember this cap here that looks sort of like a glans, the head of a penis, and I think that's deliberate. And here's an AI that I got Gemini to do of an early version of the city of Uruk, with the mound back here in the distance where they are going to build the Eanna, the temple sacred to Inanna. And here, for the subsections, I've chosen to use Babylonian notation. This is the Babylonian number 1. And originally this was a human head on a neck. That was the original Sumerian cuneiform glyph for the word person. But I believe it was transformed and simplified here into these symbols. And so I haven't substituted yet. This is still under construction. Some of the Arabic numerals. And this is one of the earliest pieces of writing that we have. And notice that, I think it's about 3200 BC, and notice that it's still pictographic. They're writing like hieroglyphs, images. This means fertility and corn, crops growing. It has something to do, and this may be the symbol for a crown. This has something to do, it looks to me like it's a receipt for a purchase of grain. But later they will simplify this into a very triangular language that becomes used by the Akkadians, very simplified. And this is the symbol for power, which is to say it's a boot. And this is the story about the victory of Uruk over the Elamite city of Arata. And Elamite is where Persia is today. And we're not sure where the city of Arata was, but somewhere there in Persia. And those were their mortal enemies, the Elamites and the Sumerians. So I do want to read the tales here of Lugalbanda. There are 3 of them. I've rendered them here as though they were 2, because the first 2, which are the best preserved, really do tell a single story. So I've put them together as the tale of Lugalbanda. And the second one, which we'll get to, which I just finished and added to this collection, it's not in the original Gilgamesh Redux that I published in 2017. And I'll get to that and show you what I've done with that. This is the symbol for Lugal. And it's interesting because this is a crown, but it looks kind of like a dagger, doesn't it? And it means great man or king. And later on, there will be a dagger in the story of Lugalbanda and his marriage to the mother of Gilgamesh, who is Lady Ninsun, or Ninsamuna, as she's lately been recognized or written as, transliterated, I suppose. So this is the cave into which he will enter. Note that it's shaped vaginally. That is intentional. I told the AI to do that. This is a lot about descending into wombs and coming back out of them. And then, so they're on the march here. This is subsection 1. I told Gemini to imagine a Sumerian army on the march. I think it did a fabulous job. So I'll go ahead and read these. Not the entire epic, just the two Gilgamesh or Lugalbanda chapters. Years later, the army of Enmerkar on its way to Arata, after trade relations have broken down, a horizon splayed with sticks of bronze spears, heavy chariots, copper helmets, human swarm of living flies ravaging the planar surface of the flat carnelian desert, coffee-brown fog of dust, sand, debris unleashed from a cleft in the earth that stains the lapis blue sky to erase the sun, a dim copper disk, wan and pale in the vanilla air, eyes ripped out of their sockets, teeth made into mortars and pestles grinding sand, a dust rain that draws the onagers pulling the carts to a dead stop. Plunged to the sand a mud effigy as his 7 brothers surrounded him, raised him up and carried him upon their shoulders, a pale Christ walking mourners in a death dirge to the mouth of a nearby cave, an ancient Paleolithic mausoleum for the gods Shamash, Ninursag, and Inanna would not heed them, and he was laid out flat on his back, gone wasted and racked with fever and ruinous dread of the demon that the sandstorm had blown inside of him, some wayward creature with blue fanned bat wings, thin spindly legs, and a ruinous, gibbering, toothless mouth that had gotten into him and now had him turned upside down. The glyph for in Sumerian mythology for someone who is sick shows a demon holding a person by the ankle upside down. A bird's nest of provisions they made him: dates, figs, dried meat, cheeses, palm baskets of eggs and oil, chunks of animal fat, loaves of bread with date syrup, ingots of butter, leather skins of water jugs of dark beer and white beer and red wine, sesame oil, aromatic oil. Notice that it's as though they're burying him. They think that he's going to die, so they put him in this cave, and essentially, and this is the prototype for what echoes later in Greek mythology as the myth of Philoctetes, with whom, because he has an injury that stinks so badly, the Achaeans drop him off at the island of Lesbos, until he heals. Later they need him, so they go back and get him. I think this is the source of that story. And they carefully placed his bronze axe near his head and tied his iron dagger imported from the Black Mountains to his chest, while sweat leaked from him in profuse oily patches that mixed with the dust from the storm to create a mud man who lay dying in the dark recesses of the cave. If the sun god restored him, he would arise from the cave, an archaic Lazarus, but if it took him to Irkalla, his body would remain stiffened and petrified for them to retrieve for proper burial on the way back from Arata. And with that mournful discussion, the brothers filed forth from the cave and emerged back out into the calcium-colored daylight beyond the cavern entrance to continue their journey to Arata. And notice here, I told the AI again to create the inside of a cave resembling a vulva with a blood moon, and that's an eclipse moon. That's significant. With a blood moon, that's an eclipse. But it's aligned directly with the cave, along with Venus, i.e. Inanna. The moons is the god Nanasin, and the sun god Utu Shamash. 2.5 days in the wasted darkness, and he lay begging for the sun god to drive the demon out of him, but he could only lie helpless, a broken rag doll, and wonder whether the darkness would claim him, and he would sink into it and feel himself dropping down into Irkalla, losing his body and becoming a shade with feathers. And the thought drove terror into him, and he begged the sun god to restore him to health. On that night, the star of Inanna, that is to say Venus, gleamed directly through the mouth of the cave, a burning vanilla stone, and he prayed to the mistress of harlots to rescue him, prayed to her to restore him to health, and the light of the mistress of the great above washed quietly over him, and the soft luminescence suffused the cavern with a nacreous glow of warmth from her light. Later the same night, the moon boat of Nanasin floated into view over the onyx sky and washed a soft effulgence into the cave, and he prayed to the god to heal him, restore him to his energies, so that he could go find his brothers and fight with them at the Battle of Arata. When, after 3 days, the sun god Shamash rose out of a crack in the earth and washed the cave clean with his gold-yellow turquoise light, Lugobando awoke and felt that the demon had been driven forth from him, for his fever was gone, and he had an appetite and was able to eat some of the provisions left behind for him by his brothers. On that day, Lugobanda rose from his cave and set out a lone stick figure, an elongated shadow of a man striding forth upon the flat desert, a thin shadow cast across its copper expanse in search of its body. He wandered the rusty hills until the trees erupted out of the dirt all around him, and rocks thrust their way up and formed skeletons of earth, and he began running, a shadow no longer. The shadow had found its maker and attached itself to the pale, wan, wasted body that the gods had regenerated, and he could feel it growing now, becoming larger and fuller as he ran that day until the sun gave way at the edge of the earth and splintered into pieces, and he found himself in a copse of trees in a forest clearing and checked a leather satchel his brothers had given him, and inside of it he found 2 flint stones that he rubbed together to make a fire, and smiled to see the flames light the leaves and kindling that he had prepared, and the glowing coals luminesced in the night like some strange jellyfish lighting up the clearing. And he rolled some dough upon a flat stone and cooked himself some bread and ate it with date syrup and slept in the all-consuming darkness where the fiery ember stars walked over the lid of the sky while he slept, In a way, the story recapitulates human history. It begins in the Paleolithic, as it were, with the coming out of the cave, the discovery of fire, and next will be animal domestication here. In the morning, he spotted a lone black bull snuffling its way through the woods, and he set a trap for it, then stripped a branch from a juniper tree that was curled up like an old man, and he tied the snorting bull to the tree. And later in the day, he caught 2 wasted leprous goats that could barely walk and tied them both to trees. And that night he slept again beneath the burning stars of On, and Zangara, the god of dreams, came to him, surfacing with a kind of spongy liquidity out of the dream fabric, and bade him sacrifice the animals at dawn and feed them to the gods. And when he awoke, the sky was still charcoal, and he grabbed his iron dagger and went over to the bull and stabbed it repeatedly over and over again until it collapsed in a muddled, bloody heap, as though it had been deflated. And then he slit the throats of the goats and carefully poured their blood into a hole he had dug into the earth, and as the sky swelled to a bloated purple color, he waited for the gods to come for their feast, and soon they came, and fed greedily upon his offerings as though they had never eaten such fine food before. But the portal through which they had entered into this world was left open behind them, and black, gibbering creatures with fangs and claws came through. Some of them had serpents for arms, and some had arms and legs that were like sticks, ending in sharp, snapping mouths with ragged teeth, and some were red with yellow eyes like coals that glowed in the dark, and some wriggled as they moved through the air, and others sailed on spiny wings and had no faces, and these creatures began to split apart, reproducing themselves as clones that spread through the air. And Lugalbanda stood looking up in the twilight from the forest floor, mouth open in amazement at such horrors. And the gods Enki, Enlil, Ninhursag, Inanna, and Ninurta went to war against them, sending blazing currents of blue-white light that neutralized them and caused them to freeze up and disintegrate into a black sooty ash that stained the air. And soon they were all gone, and the portal was closed, and the gods were gone too, and Lugalbanda lay upon the forest floor and fell asleep, exhausted. Now I took this paragraph, I just copied and pasted it, and I put it into Gemini, and I said, visualize this. And this is what that fucker came up with. That's awesome. I like how it rendered it in a kind of graphic novel style there, with Lugalbanda down looking up at these monsters that came through this portal by accident. 2. In the morning when he awoke, he didn't know where he was. He had somehow, during the battle above him the previous night, lost all sense of direction, but when he crested a nearby hill, he could see the swale of brownish-yellow landscape that swept out beyond him in all directions. This is the second Lugalbanda story, but it's clear that they belong together. And in the far distance there was an enormous hill with a tree upon it, larger than he had ever before seen in his life. And as he approached the tree, he could see that it was something so ancient, massive, and gnarled that it had been left over from a previous age of the world. And he realized then that it must be the tree of the famed Anzu bird, which, as the dawn splashed its red streaks upon the lavender sky, he could see the enormous bird spread its wings that had claws, and he could see as it raised its triangular beak that it had razor teeth like some incredibly huge Archaeopteryx. And he watched and waited for it to leave, soaring into the heavens, a huge brown thing with a long, thin, ropey tail that soon disappeared over the edge of the earth. Lugalbanda made his way to the tree, and he climbed it all the way to the nest at the top that was woven of juniper and boxwood, and inside the nest was a single young hatchling. And Lugalbanda reached into his satchel and set out some sweetmeats for the creature, and dough laced with honey, and sprinkled it with cedar scent, and rouged its eyes with kohl. And then when he was certain that the young bird had been taken care of, he descended the prehistoric tree and hid behind a limestone rock to await the return of its mother. When the creature returned, it was carrying a bull in its talons, and when it cried out to its youngling in the nest, there was no response, and it dropped the bull, and hastened to the nest to find out why there had been no greeting to its mother. And it found that its hatchling had been cared for, and provided with food, and was well looked after. And the Anzu bird looked up, and Lugalbanda could hear it speak, and it said that whoever was responsible for caring for its young should now show himself forth, and he would be rewarded by the Anzu bird and given the name, He Who Is Made Great by Anzu. And here I've told the AI to imagine it a giant Archaeopteryx as the Anzu bird that still has a tail and teeth and so forth. And this is Lugalbanda. He's obviously in the role of Mercury because the bird gives to him the power to run faster than anyone and deliver messages. That's Hermes, Mercury, same god, same planet. Lugobanda stepped forth from behind his rock, a tiny figure dwarfed by a prehistoric tree and a monstrous bird, and admitted that he had been the one responsible for caring for the bird, and that he was willing to allow the Anzu bird to determine his fate. But when the bird offered him strength and weapons, Lugobanda turned these things down, and instead asked only for the power to run faster than anyone on Earth without ever tiring. So he becomes basically the equivalent of Flash in DC Comics, the world's first superhero. So the bird granted his wish, bestowed upon him this power, and they set forth, Lugobanda speeding over the hill while the Anzu bird flew above, same thing as Hermes with wings on his feet, and spied out the troops of his father's army, while Lugobanda could see the dust they raised upon the horizon, and he thanked the bird, but the bird advised him to tell no one of his special powers, lest he arouse envy, and Lugobanda agreed, as the bird disappeared into the sapphire heavens, back to its nest. His brothers were amazed to see him, and they welcomed him and could not understand how he had been resurrected, but Lugobanda explained that he had been favored by the gods, and that they had restored him to health, and there was warm rejoicing and the drinking of beer and wine before the army once again set forth across the dusty pink plain and marched until they found themselves within a league of the city of Arata. Before they had realized it, the army had found itself trapped between the cliffs of a limestone canyon, and soon the sky was darkened with swarms of arrows that flew at them, and spears and javelins that fell upon them, and a constant rain that came down from the angled city carved into the side of the cliffs above. And this went on for month after month, until finally Enmerkar announced that someone would have to go back to Uruk to confer with Inanna and ask her why she had abandoned them. But no one volunteered for this task except Lugobanda, at whom his brothers looked askance. But his father Enmerkar agreed to allow him to go, and Lugobanda said that he would go on the condition that he go by himself and take with him only his weapons, and so his father gave him his blessings. Lugobanda sped back across the hills, pink canyons, rusty plains, and copper ravines, and he arrived at the city of Uruk that very night, and immediately made his way through its crowded streets to the Eanna temple complex, where the huge columns of Inanna's temple were covered with their stone-cone mosaics, and he went past the bald and naked priests who were bringing in her offerings, and demanded that he be allowed to see her immediately. And the priests let him past, and he went in to find Inanna at rest upon her couch, with her lion beside her, and she was surprised to see him, wondering at his lone return. And there she is, Inanna. Pretty good image. It took me about 10 iterations on Gemini to get a decent image there of Inanna with her lion. She is, of course, the lion goddess, not the prototype. The lion goddess goes all the way back to Çatalhöyük, as far as I know, where we find a similar image. It's not very good art, but it's a sculpture of a fat mother goddess with two leopards sitting either side of her. And it echoes on all the way down to Hera and the Nemean lion and so forth. And in Thomas Mann's novel, The Magic Mountain, there she turns up as Frau Shosha, meaning cat, of course, in French. He gave to her his father's message that Enmerkar, though he had built up the city on her behalf, was now at the mercy of Arata and was under siege and would perish unless Inanna did something to help them. The black-haired goddess grew pensive for a moment, and then she stood and told Lugobanda that there were two things his father must do on her behalf in order for him to win the war against Arata. There was a lone tamarisk tree along the riverbank that Enmerkar must cut down and then turn the wood into a special bucket for her. And then there was a certain type of rare fish, a geshesh fish, that he must find in the river, catch it in the bucket, prepare it, and serve it, and then he would receive the powers from her to defeat Arata, and Arata would be at his yoke once again, and trade relations would resume as they had years before. I'm thinking of our fish meal on Fridays, because Freya is the Scandinavian version of Venus. And so in Catholicism, you have fish on Friday, because the fish is also connected with the goddess. Lugobanda sped back over the desert and through the uplands to deliver Inanna's message to his father, who was delighted to hear it. Arata was soon reticulated with lines of capture, and its riches, gold, silver, lapis lazuli, poured into the coffers of Uruk. Lugobanda would become the third king of Uruk after the death of his father, and he would marry the cow goddess, Lady Ninsun, and together they would raise a child they called Gilgamesh. And so what I want to do next is read the story that I just finished writing about the tale of the courtship of Lugobanda and Lady Ninsumina. Now they're calling her Ninsumina. She used to be Ninsun. But I want to go ahead and read the original, the fragments, what's left of the original so you can see how I've changed it and altered it. And so this then is a modern translation of a third Lugalbanda story that I had forgotten about and had only peripherally been aware of and never actually interfaced with it, never read it, because all that's left of it is one tablet and maybe 10 or so stanzas, something like that. And it's kind of mysterious. So the first part of the story is missing and the last part of the story is missing. And so that's what I've filled in. So let me read you this translation, which I think is better than Thorkel Jacobson's translation that he gave, which a lot of it, when you read it, doesn't make sense. But this one does. So this is the courtship of Gilgamesh's parents, Lugalbanda and Lady Ninsamuna, who's a very rural, rustic sort of cow goddess. I've made her a milkmaid in my novel. So their translation reads here on the right-hand side, the guardian goddess Ninsamuna had brought along beer loaves. The guardian goddess Ninsamuna was sagacious. She woke him up and lay down at his feet. The clever Lugalbanda nestled the guardian goddess Ninsamuna at his side. He kisses her eyes. He kisses her mouth. Then he was again clever. Notice how the tense changes from past tense to present tense? I've done something similar in my version of this. Lugalbanda, we don't know, he spread out fresh grass there. So obviously they're in something like a cow shed or a cow byre, and they're going to have sex there. At a pleasant place with trees until dawn, they kept staying in Iriatsa. This is somewhere in Elam, and some scholars hypothesize that maybe he was a tax collector who was sent to Elam to collect taxes after they beat Arata. And he is a messenger. He is Mercury Hermes. He's a postman. Basically, that's what he is. So I've adopted that. I think that may be correct, actually. And then he runs into this cow goddess and falls in love with her. At a pleasant place with trees until dawn, they kept staying in Iriatsa. The guardian goddess Ninsamuna was sagacious. She took the tablet envelope. The guardian goddess Ninsamuna addressed herself to Lugalbanda. He brought the tablet to him. Lugalbanda prostrated himself before the N. Now the N is the primary ruler of Uruk. It's a priest king, sort of like a caliph. A Lugal, and Lugalbanda's name is obviously a Lugal, is a military king, not a priest king. But Lugalbanda, according to the Sumerian king list, becomes the next king after someone named Dumuzi. And so it goes from Enmerkar, from a Skyengasher to Enmerkar to Dumuzi to Lugalbanda to Gilgamesh, and then to Gilgamesh's son. We don't know who the Dumuzi guy was. It's obviously not the mythological Dumuzi from the original Inanna Dumuzi stories. So I've ran with that and made Dumuzi his brother, his older brother, the oldest of all 8 brothers. He has 7 brothers, and he's the youngest. And I've sort of ran with that. So they go to this courtyard in Uruk, obviously, to try to get the blessings from the high priest king, the En. The En addressed himself to Lugalbanda, that what you brought along with you from the mountains, I will admire it. The Anuna have arranged for it. The Anuna are what used to be called the Anunnaki. They keep changing the terminology. I wish they wouldn't, which are the Sumerian pantheon. That what you brought along with you from the mountains, Lugalbanda brought it out into the outer courtyard. The tablet envelope with the rim cut off. The tablet envelope of the Anuna was handed over in the courtyard. Inanna appeared from a nook. Now, Thorkel Jacobson, in his translation of this, he has an interesting footnote that I've also borrowed, where he says there's a version of this, or a piece of it that's floating around, in which Inanna says that she has picked out a wife for Lugalbanda, but that first, before they can marry, she and Lugalbanda will have sex 50 times. So now, why 50 times? Well, there are approximately 50 months in a complete 8-year cycle of Venus. Venus takes 8 years, and 8 is a number sacred to Venus, as is 6, as is 5. The 5 is the pentagram, of course, and then the 6 is from numerology, which is sacred to her, and the 8 has to do with the fact that every 8 years she will appear back in the same point of the sky. If you look in an ephemeris at where she's at, let's say she's 13 Pisces. 8 years later, she's going to be 13 Pisces. And not only that, but she traces a 5-petaled flower in the sky. And that's what becomes the pentagram that is eventually inherited by black magic and Satanists and people like that. They corrupted it, but originally it was from Inanna. Normally, though, when you see images of her, she appears with an 8-rayed star, referring to that 8-year cycle. So now she's appearing here. Inanna appeared from a nook. The guardian goddess Ninsamuna put myrtle oil on the ground. Lugalbanda, shuddering, laid himself down on the ground in the corner of the courtyard. So why is he afraid of Inanna? I've created a reason, which we'll get to in my story. Inanna addressed herself to Lugalbanda. You brought with you a spouse from the mountains, and you lay with that spouse. Now say kindly to me, as a son-in-law to a father-in-law, let me be your son. 5 men, and note that there are 5 men. They may be witnesses at the wedding, but 5 is also sacred to Venus, and Inanna is Venus. 5 men hatching? Let my family and the Anuna of your house go and stand at the gate of the outer courtyard, the family. That's all we have of it. So I thought I would write a brand new story for the deluxe edition. So let's go back to that. All right, then. So let's look at my version of the story of the tale of the courtship of Lugalbanda and Lady Ninsamuna. And here I've shown them kind of like in Return of the Jedi when they're building the Death Star. Now they're building on that mound that I pointed out earlier, the Iana complex that will be sacred to Inanna. So all these Lugalbanda stories are about Inanna, and the Gilgamesh story is too, as well, actually. Okay, and here they are. This is from Gemini. It took me a long time to get the exact image that I wanted of her as a rural, rustic cowgirl. And notice that her story parallels Enki's, or Enkidu's, rather, in the Gilgamesh epic, who begins in a rural, rustic environment as a rube, a barbarian, basically, and then transfers to an urban environment. And she does the same thing, and they both have to adapt to the conditions of the urban environment. And both Enkidu and Ninsamuna do so, and she later adopts him after Lugalbanda is dead and she's an older woman, and she becomes a dream interpreter for Gilgamesh. She interprets his dreams, and then she formally adopts Enkidu as an orphan and puts him through a ritual to become a kind of stepbrother to, or whatever you want to call it, to Gilgamesh. So, all right, number 1. She came to him in a dream and said, I've picked your wife out for you, but first you will fuck me 50 times. Thus the goddess, thus Inanna. He'd been collecting taxes in the mountains of Ilam at a place called Iratsu on behalf of his brother, the new En, Dumutzi. Enmerkar had died only a few months ago, and Lugalbanda had gone up to the mountains of Ilam, collecting from one estate after the next in the hot, dry, dusty sunlight that cooked his skin to a tan earthcliff brown. And then one day, there she was, a milkmaid, long, oaken brown hair. See, she's a variation, or I've made her a variation of Rachel at the well. Eyes the color of rain when it strikes the earth with such force that it leaves a cracked mud-brown plain in its wake, and those were her eyes. They actually had mud cracks in them if you knew where to look. And Lugalbanda knew where to look. He caught her with a beige pot of milk on her head, cows in the mint-green pasture behind her, headed for her master's estate, a few tattered cube-shaped houses that had seen better days. But the eyes, when they hit him, were precise, and he could see that she knew it too, and he knew that with a cartographer's certainty, for certainly there were cartographers who made maps of women's eyes, the kind that you could drown in without a map, those eyes. I'm looking for Inshushanak, he said. He owes taxes to His Majesty the Great En, peace be upon him, Dumutzi. He is your master, I take it? Gazing at him with something beyond certainty. Yes, she says, and all at once unaccountably, is that sure where to stand? Lean on the left foot or the right? He's not here, she's saying when he comes back to the physical plane. Would you like me to give him a message? He owes silver ingots on his property to His Majesty, who has granted him this land for helping to quell the uprising in the southern quarter of Uruk during the famine a ways back. On firmer ground now, the power of the state weighed in with each word. A lot of money, very precise and firm. Well, your En won the war with Orata, right? Naturally he owes, but I'm not sure he can pay you, to tell you the truth. And you are Lugalbanda. Damn, He's usually more certain of himself. But in his defense, this is not just some girl you come across every day. Those silvery rainwater eyes studying you intensely. And you are, just to claim some ground here after all, I'm Ninsamuna. Fucking pot of milk still on her head the whole time. You are a Lugal collecting taxes? My brother is the end, but I will be Lugal someday. You don't say. And that's important. She's ambitious. She's figuring that out. Looking at him with those rainy eyes, like studying him as though he was some country she'd heard of but never imagined she'd ever actually go to. Now, I've told the AI to create an image of an eye that is the color of rainwater, dirty rainwater. I think it did a nice job of it. But this, too, is linking back to the Sumerian eye goddess cult. For those of you who know about this, there's a whole cult that goes way back into the Neolithic where they have little statues of just a pair of eyes, and they're goddess eyes like Medusa, like the Medusa gaze that puts, he doesn't know where to stand. It's like she's Medusa, and she's frozen him. Now she's going to put a spell on him. Here it goes. And then, almost unbelievably, she says, "Do you want to fuck me?" Leather bag full of clay tablets and silver ingots. The strap suddenly feels very heavy on his shoulder, like it's trying to burrow its way into his clavicle. "Miss, I'm an official of His Majesty's court. Doesn't he fuck the women in his harem?" "Well, yes, but that's different. The end of a rook may do as he likes." "How is it different?" this one wants to know. What in the name of Erkala? "His Majesty has prerogatives that I do not have." "But aren't you his brother? Don't you have the right to fuck a mere milkmaid if you want to?" Looking at him. "And then, do you want to?" And then inside the cool, damp hay smell of the cowshed, where he mounted her several times over the course of the afternoon, the slim, sweet tunnel of her vulva sucking up the semen out of his balls over and over again. He couldn't believe how much semen he had in him. It had been a while. And now we have the first great deeds of Gilgamesh. One tiny little sperm has a particularly strong vibrating motility to its tail, so that it is able to shove the other 300 million swimmers out of the way, while many of the other sperm die with ice blue convulsions in the acidic environment inside Ninsamuna's body. And here I've told the AI to render sperm going into a cervix with one of them colored red, and that's the Gilgamesh sperm. These are his first great deeds. The milk-white swarm of sperm now pass through the cervix and arrow their way through the mucus, swimming toward the uterus, while millions die and lay in wasted rack and ruin like beached fish who can no longer breathe and are struggling and convulsing until the oxygenated air rends them to pieces. Inside the uterus, muscular contractions assist the Gilgamesh sperm on his journey toward the egg, and some of the others are destroyed by massive, monstrous, lumbering immunophagocytes, which Gilgamesh smashes into, and the phagocyte dissolves into a cloud of dark, inky murk. This is like his first monster-slaying deed. Half the sperm head for one fallopian tube, while the other half swim toward the tube containing the unfertilized egg. But Gilgamesh knows very well where the fertilized egg is, and arches himself forward with a whip-like thrust of his massive flagellal tail. Now only a few thousand remain, while inside the fallopian tube, tiny cilia, writhing like snakes, push the egg toward the uterus. The sperm must surge against this motion to reach the egg, while some of them become trapped in the cilia and die writhing in agony. During this part of the journey, chemicals in the reproductive tract cause the membranes covering the heads of the sperm to change, and as a result, they become hyperactive. But the Gilgamesh sperm sights the gigantic, squirming, orange, spongy egg, while only a few dozen of his fellow athletes remain in the long, ragged race. The monstrous, lovely egg is covered with a layer of cells beautifully known as the corona radiata. And now Gilgamesh must push his way through this layer to reach the outer layer of the egg, which is well known amongst the various tribes of sperm and fabled as the great zona pellucida, of which many tales are told. And it is actually named that, by the way. And it is there that they attach to specialized sperm receptors on the surface, which triggers their acrosomes to release digestive enzymes, which enables the Gilgamesh sperm to burrow into the lair inside the zona pellucida, where there is a narrow, fluid-filled space which he must fight his way through. It is in fact Gilgamesh who is the first to attach himself to the egg cell membrane, and within a few minutes his outer membranes fuse with hers, and the egg sucks him inside it with soft, warm, orange ecstasy. This causes changes in the membrane that prevent other sperm cells from attaching to it, and so the egg releases chemicals that push the other sperm away. Inanna doesn't want them. The losers in the race, Gilgamesh thinks with absolute scorn and derision. The convulsions spread out beyond the horizon of the zona pellucida, which now hardens and traps any survivors misfortunate enough to be caught inside the egg. Once again, he thinks, losers. And then the Gilgamesh sperm, with an abrupt convulsive shock, feels himself burst asunder in a second orgasm as genetic material erupts from his head, like some radical wayward Athena, to transform him into the male pronucleus. And inside the genetic material, it reforms into spindles of 23 chromosomes as the female genetic spindles splay out their own 23 chromosomes to create the female pronucleus. And it is Inanna, the one whom he can never get away from because she follows him from one lifetime to the next, the bitch. In the alchemical dance of sulfur and mercury that follows, the female pronuclei form spiderweb-like threads called microtubules, and with gravitational power they pull themselves toward each other, Gilgamesh and his beloved hated Inanna, two sets of chromosomes, that join together to create a unique genetic code that will become a zygote of power, determining hair and eye color, the size of his cock or his brain, and the pulsing, bloodthirsty, beating heart as the cells race through the nervous system to do a little round dance of cellular homunculi. And I told the AI to imagine a zygote that was gold, hence the alchemical reference to the extraction of the philosopher's stone, or the filius philosophorum, the philosophical child of the process. And the Gilgamesh proto-embryo is now on its way back into the cowshed. And he kissed her eyes and her mouth only afterwards, as she lay still convulsing from her own orgasms, her legs shaking as he caressed her naked breast, both of them panting with the madness of their passion and not realizing that they had just created a zygote that would one day be called Gilgamesh, a man with a ravenous sex drive and lust for power. And she had a smell that he liked, that he had never smelled before, warm, welcoming pheromones, like from some sperm-white jasmine flower. And they floated for a while like that, both coming back into their physical bodies from their sex dream journeys only gradually. And now it was back to being physical again, with duties and responsibilities. Demutsi. What was he going to tell his brother about the taxes that he didn't collect from Inshushanak? Lugabanda had never been good with women. He always felt awkward around them and never quite knew what to say, so he normally avoided them. But this milkmaid, this cowgirl, she did most of the talking for him, and that made it easier, so he just lay there in the cowshed with the wind making it creak in the dark, shadowy corners where small spiders lived and set up their kingdoms of transforming glittering emerald flies into dull gray mummies. And he listened to her talk about Inshushanak's land, and her brother and her sister, Hilmaz and Damu. Both of them were older and doing interesting things in the city, where Hilmaz was a priestess in the Japar, and Damu was a healer who knew everything there was to know about the human body and how the star gods wove themselves through its fibrils in subtle etheric currents of blue-gold biogenic energies that could get blocked, those energies, and then Namtar would seize you and turn you upside down, and I can take you with me to the city of Uruk, he interrupted her, and we could be married there. We will go to see the end, Demutsi, my brother, and obtain his blessing, and then Inshushanak will receive the bride price in place of his taxes. Your brother would cover that for you? Of course, I am his brother, and he is the end. Why wouldn't he? Normally, they would need blessings from both fathers, who would have to agree on a bride price, but Enmerkar was dead, and she said her father Pabalsag was a wandering horseman, whom she hadn't seen since she was 7 years old, and her mother Urash was a healer, who lived in Arata, but Demutsi was the end of Uruk, and his blessing was all they needed, Lugabanda insisted, and so off they went to Uruk. Now these are, scholars think that possibly Ninsamuna's mother might have been the goddess Urash, who is the same thing as the goddess Gula, who is the mistress of medicine and healing. So I went with that, and also possibly that her father was Pabalsag, but Pabalsag is a centaur, who later becomes the sign of Sagittarius. So I've put in those connections. And then Damu as her brother, Hilmaz I made up. It's a name that just means beautiful. Damu is a real god who is a child also of Urash/Gula and is a healer as well. 2. In the palatial courtyard of Uruk, where he and Ninsamuna are standing before, now I've switched from past tense to present tense, just like the story does, are standing before his brother Demutsi, who has descended one side of a short flight of twin stairs from a platform upon which 4 gigantic columns hold up the flat rectangular roof of the palace. The columns are covered with a stone cone mosaic of red lozenges and watery blue chevrons, and the summer with the sun at its noon has eaten everyone's shadows, and there are flies everywhere tormenting the bare brown skins of the shirtless men coming and going. Dumuzi stands before them, wearing a round cap shaped like a glans. Remember that statue of Enmerkar with his cap that we looked at? With hands clasped, wearing a white linen robe that covers his left shoulder and zigzags down, leaving the right shoulder bare. He is attended by two silent, bald-headed men to his left and a fan-bearer on his right who tirelessly waves the feathery fan over Dumuzi's head, and a man with a parasol stands near, doing his best to keep the end shaded from the gigantic orange fury of the pitiless desert sun. She is very beautiful, my little brother, I'll give you that. But tell me, seriously, you are going to marry a commoner? Lugalbanda is playing with his short black beard and stands in the hot gold sunlight, gazing shrewdly at his brother. Ninsamuna stands beside him, blinking in the sunlight, up at them both. To her they seem like giants. That doesn't matter to me, Lugalbanda says, nor should it to you, or any of the rest of the court for that matter. I happen to know that a lot of them are married to commoners. Dumuzi stands, gazing in silence down at the small, beautiful, brown-eyed girl with oak-wood hair, as though trying to sum up her value. It shall be done, he announces upon coming to his mental conclusion. Lugalbanda smiles, but Ninsamuna does not. On one condition, Dumuzi says. There is a moment of silence in the courtyard. Even the flies seem to have stopped their jerky, obsessive-compulsive trajectories. Lugalbanda's smile has become a ghost. What condition would that be, my brother? That I exert my royal prerogative with the young lady Ninsamuna before the marriage. You fucking prick, Lugalbanda thinks, but does not say. She's no virgin, he says instead. I didn't think that she would be, but that is not the point. And the point would be what? It is my right as N, which you know very well. He pauses while a thought occurs to him. You may inform Inshushinek that I will forgive his debt to me. That's good news, Lugalbanda thinks, but does not say it. It is at this point, however, that Lugalbanda notices a tall, black-haired woman in the crowd of people milling near the dun-colored wall, and he recognizes at once the woman from his dream, who is wearing a white linen shift with necklaces of lapis lazuli and carnelian, while gold leaf-shaped earrings dangle from her ears. Inanna. She is gazing pointedly at him with her black eyes, and then he hears her voice talking to him telepathically. I picked her out for you, Lugalbanda, because you move too fast for any woman but Ninsamuna to stick to you. And don't forget, our deal, 50 fox. He looks back at his brother, but the woman has gone when he tries to pick her out in the crowd. Bring her to me freshly prepared for this evening, the Ent says, and then, together with his retinue, dissolves into the palatial machinery. He looks at Ninsamuna. She seems very much smaller than he ever remembered her being. Now remember that Ninsamuna is a cow goddess, Gilgamesh's mother, and Hathor is the cow goddess in Egypt, who, as her name implies, House of Horus, may originally have been the mother of Horus there, who is also, like Gilgamesh, a sun god. Interesting, a lot of overlaps between these two civilizations. Back to present tense, or rather past tense. Ninsamuna, however, had other things in mind. The room which Lugalbanda had given her was small but tastefully furnished, with red woolen rugs on the floor over which lines of sheep were crawling. Large rust-colored clay pitoi were arranged in the corners and along the wall, and above the bed, high up in the wall, were 3 square windows through which a roseate twilight was glowing. It took me a while to get this image out of the AI. It was like 10 tries before I finally got what looks like a believable Sumerian sort of hotel room, you might say. The room was lit with a bronze brazier that stood up on a tripod and sent shadows scurrying up the walls like small creatures. Friezes adorned with red, blue, and black diamonds, chevrons, and bulls alternating with gazelles had been painted along the walls, and a chair with ivory legs carven into the shape of a bull's feet was set in one corner across from the bed where her assistant Ninshubur was currently laying out for her the garments and jewelry that were expected of a woman about to have an erotic encounter with the N. The bull's feet on the chair, note that, because she's connected to the cow goddess, but remember it. The lady who wore her graying hair tucked up in a bun at the back of her head bathed Ninsamuna with water and a woolen rag, and then anointed her with a perfume made of calamus, cypress, and balsam, which smelt to her like attar of roses. When the attendant had left, Ninsamuna took her time lovingly dressing herself with beautiful things that she had always fantasized about wearing, but never for one moment thought that she ever actually would have the opportunity to do so. First, she drew a thin linen shift over her body that was almost diaphanous and left her right shoulder bare. Then she put on an exquisite triple-stranded necklace of lapis lazuli beads, alternating with gold ones and a gold rosette in the center with precisely 12 petals. That matters. And then a second necklace made of carnelian beads that reminded her of little chunks of frozen blood. That's a foreshadowing. She held up a polished copper mirror to admire a ghost version of herself, whom she had rarely seen except in stagnant pools of water. Lovely. Then she put the mirror down and picked up a gold ring which she slipped over her left wrist and which caught chips of firelight from the brazier that flicked back at her. Then she put on a pair of gold crescent-shaped earrings through the holes that Ninshibur had pierced for her and were still leaking tiny drops of blood. Then she placed a gold-leaf tiara on top of her dark brown hair and looked at herself in the copper mirror again. Loveliness. Finally, she held up the copper mirror and carefully drew black coal around her eyes with a tiny bone that must have come from some sort of a bird. Evening had come. She was nervous, but determined to go through with this. Now, the attentive reader will have counted how many things she put on. The clothing, the jewels, and even the coal outlining her eyes, and it's 7, which then echoes the 7 items of clothing that Inanna puts on before she descends into hell, Irkala, to meet with her sister Ereshkigal, where she has to undergo a death and a resurrection. And what that actually is, it corresponds to the 7 planetary spheres. When the soul descends through the 7 planetary spheres, it takes on the qualities of each of those spheres, such as, for instance, Mars, it takes on the quality of aggressiveness. Venus, it takes on the quality of sexuality, and so forth. So that's what it's symbolizing. And so when she gets down there, she has to take off everything until she's naked. That's the soul divesting itself of all of the subtle bodies, the etheric body, the astral body, the intellectual soul, the consciousness soul, the egoic soul, and so forth, to use the terminology of Rudolf Steiner. But that's what this is about now. This is not Inanna, but she is acting like Inanna. So the implication is that she's being possessed by Inanna. Lugabanda, meanwhile, was asleep and dreaming of Inanna. And so this would mean that if Inanna is possessing Ninsamuna, she's bilocating in these sexual dreams, and there are precisely 7 of these that mirror her 7 items of clothing that she puts on. Here it's 7 sex positions. They were on a bed in a room lit with fire shadows that squirmed over the walls while she sat on top of him, cowgirl style, grinding into him until he came so hard that he screamed. But in the dream world, he apparently had an inexhaustible supply of semen, for next he found himself drilling into her from behind while she climbed the crumbling mud brick wall, moaning as she came again and again. And then he found himself thrusting into her with her beneath him, legs splayed in the air in the shape of a V, their bodies slippery with sweat like a pair of snakes. And then he was sitting on a chair, and she was riding him with her back turned to him as he watched his cock slide in and out of her from behind. And then they were on the bed again, and now she was riding him a reverse cowgirl. And again he had a beautiful view of his cock sliding in and out of her wet vulva. Note the repetition of the cowgirl. Inanna and Ninsamuna are swapping signifiers, you might say. And then they were cowgirl, and then she was standing up against a flickering wall while he plunged into her from behind. And then they were a pair of scissors grinding into each other on the woolen bed sideways. And unbelievably to his dream avatar, this went on for 43 more times, until the sound of somebody screaming in the palace pulled him back into his physical body. 5. 5 is a number that's sacred to Venus, as we mentioned with the pentagram and the 5-petaled lotus or flower that she traces in the sky every 8 years. Ninsamuna stood naked before the En, who was drinking palm wine and allowing his eyes to crawl over her pink gold firelit flesh as she stood before him in front of the wool-stuffed bed that rested on 4 ivory legs carved into the shape of lion's paws. Now she's being possessed by Inanna's Vahana, which is to say the lion goddess. She means business. He had already removed his cap from his bald head and unfastened his red linen kilt and tossed it carelessly aside, and she could see his very long and very thick, erect penis waiting for her to give it attention. The tip of it glowed in the firelight like someone had burnished it. "Who wants to plow my field?" Ninchaber said to him, smiling evilly as she stepped with bare feet on the soft woolen rug and climbed into the bed with him, her perfume an intoxicant, and his as well. It smelled, she guessed, like musk. She backed into his face while she took his erect cock into her mouth and lovingly massaged it with her tongue, while his tongue lightly touched her clit. She could tell he was good at sex, this Dumuzi was, but she wasn't about to let the pleasure distract her, as she had something very specific in mind for this particular occasion of droit de seigneur. After about 5 minutes of this, she got up and offered to lay down on her back and spread her legs for him. His cock was still wet with her saliva and his precum, and was obviously very eager for her vulva. As she felt the weight of his heavy, lean, muscular body on top of her, and then his cock very slowly slid into her and began furiously pumping, and while he was moaning, she reached down beneath the bed where Lugalbanda had hidden the bronze dagger and plunged it straight into his heart. Later she would remember how remarkably easy it was to kill someone, especially if you knew precisely where to stick the knife, as Lugalbanda had instructed her. As the blood ran over her, she shoved the dead weight of this now empty body off of her, and then looking at his dying cock, she took it in her blood-warmed left hand, and with her right she sliced it off of him. Again, it was remarkable how easy all this was. His cock felt like some sort of squishy sea creature in her hand, as she then proceeded to stuff it into his gaping mouth, jamming it down in there with the aid of the butt of Lugalbanda's dagger. And it was just then, as she stood there with blood clads creating brand new rivers all over her body, that the screaming began. 6. 6 is a number that is numerologically sacred to Venus. Ninsanuma was not executed due to the power and influence of Lugalbanda, who was the last surviving member of a family of 8 brothers, he being the youngest and Dumuzi the oldest. The throne was his now, and there was nobody to gainsay him or his choice of his brother's murderer and a commoner at that as his queen, and so she was elevated to the status of Lady Ninsamuna. And precisely 8 months later, as though eager to get the cooking over with and get out into the world to effectuate his mighty deeds, Gilgamesh was born. 8 is also sacred to Venus, as we have seen. All right, that's my version of the conception and birth of Gilgamesh and how Lady Ninsamuna, I wish they hadn't changed the name. It's harder to say. Ninsun was just 2 syllables. But okay, whatever it is. And then she's been elevated from a commoner and a rube, basically, a rural girl, a farm girl, to now the queen of Uruk. And so we'll find out what happens. So this book is not done yet. I'm still working on it. It'll take me probably about another week to complete it with all the illustrations and so forth. But it'll be available probably in about a week or 2 on Amazon, so look for it there. The old one is there too still. If you type in Gilgamesh Redux, it'll come up. That's the old one, the paperback one. Don't get that one. Get the new one, but it will be expensive, probably either $49.99 or $59.99 because it's longer than the poetry books, and it depends on Amazon's pricing system, what price I can determine for it, because hardcover in full color is very and super high-res at that. We've used AI software to high-res the images. It's very expensive to do. So, and we, my brother and I, have set up a GoFundMe for our Iconic Books operation, and I'll put the link for that down below. We would greatly appreciate any donations that you could manage. We have a lot of books to publish, a whole line of them. And so I do this full time now, and that requires funding and financing and so forth. Americans don't have a tradition of really much of financing, being patrons of the arts, the way, let's say, the Medici family was in the Renaissance. They realized if you want nice things, you have to make the money flow to Leonardo and Michelangelo, and then nice things come out of that. Americans have come out of the selfish capitalist model, where it's just every man for himself, and art is regarded as a silly, sloppy pastime, because most of it is, and philosophy is laughed at and ridiculed, because the philosophers deconstructed themselves, so if they don't take themselves seriously, why should anyone else? So that's the way it is. But you can't make things happen in the arts without money. It has to flow. Okay, then. That's the Lugalbanda stories from my new novel, Gilgamesh Redux Squared.